We're now moving on to another area of development, another time point in development that a lot of early college students are very familiar with, emerging adulthood. Um, Both adolescence and emerging adulthood are both relatively new um, stages of development, if we consider development to be somewhat stage-like, in the sense that they didn't exist for much of human history. There was no such thing as adolescence or emerging adulthood, and adolescence probably appeared a bit earlier than emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood kind of captures those years between 18 and 25. It's sometimes referred to as young adulthood or youth, but it's now widely thought of as a separate developmental stage. And the reason that it's new is because of the changes in technology that have occurred over the past 60 to 70, 80 even years ago. Past 60 years, that is. In other words, there's been a lot of changes in many societies around the world where after graduating high school, which is typically around the age of 18, one typically does not go right into the workforce to work in a job that they'll likely stay in for the rest of their lives. They now go to college, and what we see is that during this time period of emerging adulthood, individuals are not as independent as they would have been historically. So the name that has been given to this time period, which represents this change, is emerging adulthood. Um, and this time period is characterized by typically good health. Traditionally, the years between 18 and 25 were, as I said, a time for hard work and childbearing. That was, in the early 1900s, between 18 and 25. Again, that's when you are doing a lot of work if you're a male, and a lot of childbearing if you're a female. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the survival rate of infants was drastically lower, and so starting early allowed you to have the number of children that would survive that you wanted, taking into account the fact that there was a much higher death rate for infants. Physical worth and parenthood are no longer expected of every young adult in the 21st century, however, as I said, due to a lot of changes that have taken place in society. The current level of food availability means that in almost every nation now, emerging adults have reached full height, girls usually by the age of 16, boys by the age of 18. And again, this is something that historically was not the case. This is a good example of the interaction of our genes and our environment where, height differences are largely due to genetic differences, although one individual who is malnourished will certainly not reach the same height as another individual with identical genetics who is well nourished. And so, around the world now, there's a much higher level of food availability. For both sexes, muscle growth and fat accumulation continue into the early 20s when women attain adult breast and hip size and men reach full shoulder width and arm strength. By age 20, the immune system has developed well enough to fight off everything from sniffles to cancer. Illnesses are far less common in emerging adulthood. Usually blood pressure is normal, teeth develop no new cavities, heart rate is steady, the brain is fully grown, not necessarily by 18, but certainly by the end of emerging adulthood, around 25. And lung capacity is as large as it will ever be. So what we see is that death from disease that affects many older adults almost never occurs during emerging adulthood. So we can see here the U.S. deaths from the top 4 diseases by age, again, from 15 to 24, only 8 per 100,000, whereas by the time we reach the 55 to 64 age group, that number has increased relatively substantially, and it continues to increase precipitously, where by 85 there's a much higher rate of death from the top 4 diseases. Those top causes: heart disease, cancer, stroke, and obstructive pulmonary disease. Highly likely to affect 85-year-olds, extremely unlikely to affect people from 15 to 24, although it does happen. Another place where we can see some of these age differences and just how healthy individuals are in emerging adulthood is in terms of homeostasis. Homeostasis is the adjustment of all the body's systems to keep physiological functions in a state of equilibrium. And as the body ages, it takes longer for these adjustments to occur. So it becomes harder for older bodies to adapt to stress, and that stress could be anything from stressors in our day-to-day life to just regulating our own temperature. But it's important to consider that age is probably not really the most important factor, although this is what typically characterizes emerging adulthood, is that there's good adjustment of all these systems. Really, nutrition and exercise underlie health at every age, and that may be the more important factor rather than age. In terms of the sexual reproductive system, it's especially vigorous during emerging adulthood. The sex drive is powerful, infertility is rare, orgasm is frequent, and birth is easy, with fewer complications in the early 20s than at any other time. Sexual reproductive characteristics are produced by sex hormones, and those sex hormones peak in both sexes at about age 20. Although the sex drive itself is somewhat higher in males in the early 20s, higher in females in the early 30s. As an illustration of this, with frequent intercourse and without contraception, the average woman in her early 20s becomes pregnant within about 3 months. As I said, the most important factors that have contributed to the development of this time period of emerging adulthood have a lot to do with globalization, advanced technology, and modern medicine. What these things have also provided us are effective means of contraception, which are now available in almost every nation. So as fewer infants die, people no longer need to begin childbearing before age 20 or to have 4 or more children simply to ensure that some of their children will survive, because again, the death rate is much lower than it ever has been historically. And so what we're talking about here is the replacement rate. In other words, the number of births per woman that would be required to maintain a nation's or a world's population with no increases or decreases. And this figure, the current replacement rate is considered to be about 2.1 births per woman. So that means that just over 2 individuals would be sufficient on average to replace parents, and that has a lot to do with the fact that it's highly likely that infants will survive to a reproductive age. And this is a trend that has shown that birth rates have declined all over the world, with developing as well as developed nations recording lower fertility rates. These advances in contraception have not only reduced the birth rate, they've also increased the rate of sexual activity, especially among unmarried adults. And globally, emerging adults have fewer babies but engage in more sexual activity than older adults, whether they're married or not, and as well as compared to their own age historically. In other words, 20-year-olds of today as compared to 20-year-olds from the earlier 20th century. Half of all emerging adults in the United States have at least one sexually transmitted infection, and we can infer that this probably has a lot to do with the changes in sexual activity and changes in both the likelihood of being married at a certain time and how often individuals can have sex due to contraception. Emerging adulthood is also marked by a much greater willingness to take risks of all sorts, not just sexual ones. Young adults enjoy danger. They drive without seatbelts, carry guns, try addictive drugs. So keep in mind that there's a a relatively fine distinction between the early stages of emerging adulthood at around age 18, if we consider it to be then, and the very end of adolescence, which if we consider that to be about 17, again, the difference between 17 and 18-year-olds is really negligible. And one of the terms that's been used to characterize this this behavior of emerging adults is it's called edge work. These are occupations or recreational activities or other ventures that involve a degree of risk or danger. Again, much more likely in emerging adulthood. The prospect of living on the edge makes edge work compelling for some individuals. And one example of this is extreme sports, forms of recreation that include apparent risk of injury or death, and that are attractive and thrilling as a result. Drug abuse is still problematic in emerging adulthood, as it was in adolescence to some extent. Drug abuse we can define as the ingestion of a drug to the extent that it impairs the user's biological or psychological well-being. That is, this definition is what differentiates drug use from drug abuse. Drug use is simply the use of a drug. Abuse involves the use to an extent that it impairs the user's biological or psychological well-being. And a potential adverse consequence of drug abuse is the possibility of becoming addicted to a drug. This is a condition in which of drug dependence in which the absence of the drug, given the individual's system, produces a drive, either physiological, biological, or both, to ingest more of a drug, or that should actually say psychological, biological, or both, to ingest more of a drug. And so we can see here in this graph, 8th graders are by far the lowest for all these categories, having used any illicit drug, smoked marijuana, cigarettes, or gotten drunk in the past 30 days, whereas 12th graders and emerging adults are pretty even with the exception of getting drunk. Emerging adults, ages 19 to 25 in this case, in this particular study, were far more likely than 12th graders to have gotten drunk in the past 30 days. And this likely has a lot to do with the fact that a large portion of emerging adults in that group were of legal drinking age, so it becomes much easier to get alcohol at that point. Drug abuse is particularly common among those who die violently. In the United States, between the ages of 15 and 25, almost one male in every 100 dies violently through either suicide, homicide, or a motor vehicle accident. About 4 times as many young men as young women commit suicide or die in a motor vehicle accident, and 6 times as many are murdered. Violent deaths are particularly more common for males. So what do we do about this? How do we try to reduce those statistics that I just spoke of? One method is the social norms approach. This is a method of reducing risky behavior among emerging adults. It's based on their desire to follow social norms. So social norms are sort of what everyone is around an individual is doing. What are the average 20-year-olds doing? And it turns out that if you ask a 20-year-old, how much do other 20-year-olds drink, what you see is that they tend to overestimate the extent to which they're engaging in things like drug abuse or other high-risk behaviors. And so this approach attempts to publicize survey results to make emerging adults aware of the actual prevalence of various behaviors within their peer group. As we discussed with adolescents and the previous age groups, as we get older, we become more cognitively sophisticated. And one way that our viewpoint changes, as demonstrated by Gisela Labouveif, well, she investigated age differences in the way that people describe themselves. And she categorized their self-descriptions among different age groups into one of four different patterns. Self-protective, these were individuals who were high in self-involvement but low in self-doubt. Dysregulated, these were individuals who were fragmented and overwhelmed by emotions or problems. Complex were individuals who valued openness and independence above all else. And then there were individuals who were integrated, labeled as integrated. They were able to regulate their emotions and use logic. Results of her study, what she found was that no one under age 20 had reached the advanced integrated stage, but some adults of every age had. And the largest shift in self-description was toward higher levels between adolescence and emerging adulthood. In other words, if we look at this graph here, which shows her findings, she included people from 11 to 15 all the way to 70 to 85. And again, people gradually became less self-centered and less confused as they described themselves over the years of adulthood. Many adults, but no children or adolescents, achieved a level of self-acceptance at which emotion and reason were integrated. Although you can see that that was much more likely to be the case in this group here, the 20 to 30. They were much more likely to be integrated, although the 45 to 60 were also less likely, more likely, but they were also less likely to be dysregulated. So some interesting trends here across the age ranges. Another thing that although cognition is advancing, we are still susceptible to the effects of certain environmental factors. And one of those environmental factors is called stereotype threat. This is the fear that someone else will judge one's appearance or behavior negatively, and thereby confirm a person's prejudiced attitudes. So the mere possibility of being negatively labeled or stereotyped is believed to arouse anxiety that can disrupt cognition and distort emotional regulation. And stereotype threat makes people of all ages doubt their ability, which reduces learning if their anxiety interferes with cognition. So, in other words, to sort of sum up, stereotype threat. If you belong to a group that there's a stereotype against, okay, let's use females for instance, okay, if there's a stereotype against females that they are bad drivers, if you make females cognizant of the stereotype threat, in other words, if you make them aware that there is this stereotype that they're bad drivers, and then you assess their driving ability, they're actually going to make more errors than they would if you had just tested their driving ability without making that stereotype more salient in their minds. As another illustration of this, we can see a study that was done by Aronson, where they had three groups of individuals. So Aronson and colleagues, they were looking at attitudes and grades in the academic term following a stereotype threat experiment. So in group one here, they did nothing. There was no intervention. That was just a control group. They were assessed, and they found that blacks had viewed had valued academics less than whites, and their grade was just slightly lower on average than it was for whites. In groups 2 and 3, they were treated somewhat differently. These were the more experimental types of groups. Group 2 was they were given a task that would make them aware of the fact that IQ is multiply determined. And group 3 was given a task that made them more cognizant or more aware of the fact that IQ is malleable. And the hypothesis here was that academic performance would increase in people uh, who internalize the belief that intelligence is plastic and can be changed. In other words, if you don't think that intelligence can be changed, if you do not think it's malleable, as Group 3 was induced to believe, then you're likely not going to change your performance. And we can see that Group 3 was the only one that really differed from the other two groups, and the researchers concluded that it was because of the fact that um, they had made the group members, the members of Group 3, um, more aware of the fact that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that your IQ, your intellect, your intelligence is not just a fixed inborn trait, but rather something that is plastic, malleable, and changeable over time. And as you can see, when black students are led to believe this, they tend to place a higher value on an education, and they also ended up doing slightly better the following term. The white students in that group also had done somewhat better, but they didn't necessarily place any higher value on academics. So this was an example of the stereotype threat. Um, Most contemporary students attend college primarily to secure their vocational and financial future. College also correlates with better health. College graduates everywhere, they smoke less, they eat better, they exercise more, and they live longer. Um, and there's no doubt that tertiary education, in other words, college, improves verbal and quantitative abilities, knowledge of specific subject areas, skills in various professions, reasoning, and reflection. But it also has these other benefits as well, in the sense that there are all these other positive health outcomes associated with it. Um, I'm not going to go through this whole entire table here, but this is table 11.3 from our textbook. What we can see in this table is this researcher, Perry's scheme of cognitive and ethical development during college. Um, I'd like you to take a look at this in a bit more detail than I'm going to go through right now, but what this is showing you is that he described 9 levels of cognitive progress over the 4 years leading to the BA degree. In other words, he tracked individuals over the course of their 4 years of college, and he found that students going from, again, freshman to sophomore to junior to senior, they had moved from from a simplistic either or dualism. In other words, having the sense that things are either right or wrong, that people either succeed or fail, to more of a relativistic point of view that recognizes multiplicity of perspectives. In other words, there's not just one view of things that can be right. And we've talked about this before, that one example of this might be in terms of thinking in terms of dualisms, the idea that, oh well, this thing is either due to genes or it's due to the environment. And what he's saying is that as this cognitive maturity takes place, we start to recognize that, well, it's not one or the other. It's more of the fact that these two things, these our genes and our environment, interact with one another to ultimately produce the individuals that we become. And so new questions and advanced thinking occur because of the combined influence of lots of things that students experience throughout college, interactions and discussions with fellow students, books, discussions, and whatnot. If we look at personality, in terms of, to what degree does it remain pretty consistent across age, or to what extent does it tend to change as we get older? Most research on personality traits of twins from ages 17 to 24 finds both genetic continuity and developmental improvements. In other words, there's a certain degree of stability in our personality, that we are pretty much, that we have many similar personality traits today that we did when we were younger, but that there are also some changes that take place. And in particular, emerging adults tend to be open to new experiences. They tend to become somewhat less so during older age, but during emerging adulthood, they're more open to new experiences. There's a trend toward less depression and more joy, along with more insight into the self. In other words, we start realizing things in emerging adulthood that we hadn't really recognized about ourselves during adolescence. Um, Many stresses and transitions of emerging adulthood might be thought to reduce self esteem, but research seems to suggest otherwise. Dealing with transitions successfully, especially leaving home, achieving identity, attending and then graduating from college, and securing a full time job, correlates with well being. However, worldwide, adults are more likely to have an episode of mental illness during emerging adulthood than at any other time. So, although this is a time period in life that's characterized by health and self-esteem and positive personality changes, it's also a time that people who are susceptible are most likely to develop a psychological disorder. And this can really be explained by the diathesis stress model. This is the view that psychological disorders are produced by the interaction of a genetic vulnerability, which is the diathesis, and stressful environmental factors and life events. So, people who have a genetic predisposition to develop a psychological disorder, whether it's the cumulative effect of stressors over time that eventually brings out mental illness, or whether there's something a bit closer to the emerging adulthood time period itself, is somewhat a subject of contention, but it is one of the most likely time points of developing a mental illness. And each particular psychopathology has a developmental trajectory, becoming more common at certain ages than at others. In addition to substance use disorders, specific other problems such as mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and schizophrenia are more likely to appear in emerging adulthood. Identity achievement, although it's not guaranteed to take place, and this search originally begins at puberty, it continues much longer. For most emerging adults, they're actually still seeking to determine who they are. Um, Erickson believed that at each stage, the outcome of earlier crises provides the foundation for each new era. And in fact, probably the idea that identity achievement is not attained as early as it maybe was in the past is directly related to the fact that we now have this time point called emerging adulthood. So part of our identification has to do with our ethnic identity. About half of 18 to 25-year-olds identify with very specific ethnic groups, and more than any other age group, emerging adults have friends with diverse backgrounds. So it almost makes it a little bit more salient, our ethnic identity. Ethnic identity may affect choices in language, manners, romance, employment, neighborhood, religion, clothing, and values. So it's got a widespread impact. And more so than any other age group, emerging adults, they become more aware of these things. Um, Intimacy. This is Erickson's sixth psychosocial stage, and the conflict here is between intimacy versus isolation. It particularly emphasizes that humans are social creatures, and intimacy progresses from attraction to close connection to ongoing commitment. Marriage and parenthood, as emerging adults are discovering, are only two of several paths to intimacy. Friendships, throughout life are beneficial to us, and that friends help us defend against distress and provide joy. Friends new and old are particularly crucial during emerging adulthood. And most single adults have larger and more supportive friendship networks than newly married young adults once did. Robert Sternberg had described three distinct aspects of love: passion, which is an intense physical, cognitive, and emotional onslaught characterized by excitement, ecstasy, and euphoria. Intimacy refers to knowing someone well, sharing secrets as well as sex. And commitment grows gradually through decisions to be together, mutual caregiving, kept secrets, shared possessions, and forgiveness. And these three aspects of love can either be high or low, and of course anywhere in between, and they can be combined in many ways. In other words, you could be high in passion but low in intimacy and low in commitment, or you could be high in all three, or you could be relatively low in all three. So, if we try to dichotomize whether it's present or not, rather than just saying high or low, if we say either no or yes, he said that there are these different types of love here. Again, based on the presence or absence of these three different dimensions: passion, intimacy, and commitment. So when you like someone, there's no passion there, and no real commitment, but there's intimacy. Infatuation is characterized by passion with the absence of the other two. Empty love is when there's commitment only. People are just staying together because they've committed to one another rather than because of any passion or intimacy. And of course, the most ideal situation is to have all three, and he called that consummate love, where there's passion, intimacy, and commitment all together. So those are Sternberg's 7 forms of love. Not everyone has to be married in order to live together. More and more people are deciding to cohabit, that is, live with an unrelated person, typically a romantic partner to whom one is not married. Most young adults in the United States, England, and Northern Europe now cohabit before they marry, rather than marry before age 25. And again, this is a relatively new emerging trend that wasn't present in the earlier part of the 20th century. Divorce is common, ending about 45% of U.S. marriages, and it's also difficult, not only for the partners, but also for their families, their parents, as well as their children. Domestic violence and excessive drinking are more likely to occur among young adults who cohabit than among those who marry, and married couples are more likely to divorce if they have lived together before marriage. In terms of family, emerging adults are supposedly independent, leaving their childhood home and parents behind. However, parents continue to be crucial influences after age 18, much more so now than in the past. And fewer emerging adults today have established their own families, secured high-paying jobs, or achieved a definitive understanding of their identity goals. And it's really these things here that characterize, what emerging adulthood is really all about, is the fact that they typically have not yet established their own families, have not established their ultimate job that they'll hold, or even achieved a definitive understanding of their identities and goals.